well, we'll get into it, but basically how to come up with like the high concept ideas, the really conceptual, symbolic things that seem really obvious when people look at them, but they're like not the first thing that people think of. They're not cliche or trite. Because there are some actual, we used to have it a podcast. Yeah, today's topic is iterating for high concept ideas. So one of the things I've noticed with myself and with students that I'm working with and other things like that is that the first idea that people come up with is typically, unless you've gone through a huge amount of training to not do this, is typically the most trite, cliche, boring, obvious thing. Some people call it say, where it's like, if there's something, somebody describes something and you're supposed to do like an editorial illustration that goes with that article or whatever, or a t-shirt about that concept or whatever, that you literally just depict the literal thing as it's described. So the illustration is pointless, almost, because it's just reiterating what the text says. Beyond that, several levels beyond that, you have this concept where the illustration and the text together make something new that neither of them is doing on its own. And even beyond that, you have illustrations that don't need explanation and are able to give out kind of these interesting concepts. So let's kind of talk about like the techniques. There's some So I want to get to some of these comments. So Holly, I get ideas for composition while sketching from life. The concepts for products actually have a lot more thought than just illustrations. And I think paying attention to life is really important.
Yeah,
I've gotten so many different ideas just because I notice how a leaf connects to a branch, or like the pattern.
Yeah.
In certain different types of grass. Like there's a lot in just like observing and cataloging and being curious. I think if you can develop like curiosity, I think that's really important. Animate for the sell of it says, we do table reads or pitch storyboards to other directors. And this helps the story not be boring or confusing.
Yeah.
This is another one that I do a lot, which is I use other people as a sounding board, because I'm an audio kinesthetic, which means that I have to hear something for it to really make sense to me. And so articulating it out loud helps me flesh it out, and I can actually come up with better ideas on the fly while I'm talking. Like I'm one of those guys that's like, I'm going to start this sentence. I don't really know where it's going to go, but I'll probably figure it out by the time I get to the end of the sentence. So I think that's really good too. And then Greg Kemble is saying he watched a documentary about Milton Glaser, or Glasser, right? He talked about creating a gap for people to have to figure things out.
Yeah, there's a term for that too, like in illustration, at least like at the school I went to, and I think a lot of illustrators use it. They call it the aha moment, and it's something you're always seeking after as an illustrator, whether it's in a page turn where you have like a moment of like, what? Oh, like right. It's that aha moment. And if you can create that with a singular illustration or a narrative illustration, like that's kind of what you're seeking after. It doesn't have to be like the, he sees dead people and that's because he's a ghost. Like it doesn't have to be that kind of like crazy gimmicky plot twist. But giving
that's only gimmicky because it was so incredible at the time. Yes. Now it's becoming.
Yeah. And well, what I mean by that is like it doesn't have to be the thing that once it's played, it's hard to play a second time.
Right.
It can be a concept that still kind of carries meaning multiple times, but still seeking after that moment where you have somebody have a journey with you, and also you assume better of your audience. I think that's a good call.
I also think there's this concept of like trusting your audience to get it. Like you want to give them enough to solve the puzzle, but you don't want to solve the puzzle for them. As soon as you have to explain the joke, it's not funny, right?
Yeah.
As soon as you have to, like this works because it doesn't work, And then Frank was saying, Oh wait, no, this is the one I wanted to bring up. That he gets ideas through going through Josh's garbage. So,
but I'm glad you were brought up because I feel like so the attack of literacy was one of my better ideas, and one of the ways that was come up with was like I literally was at a Barnes and Noble, and at the time Barnes and Nobles had these beautiful illustrations of authors having coffee, like kind of lining the walls. And I was like, I would love to come up with a concept where I could draw all of the great literary authors like in a big crowd scene. And I was trying to think like what kind of thing would make that funny or interesting. And then I remember going home and I collected B movie posters and I had them lining my wall. And I was like, I love B movie posters. Wouldn't it be funny if it was like all these authors? So like that's how the attack of literacy idea came from, was like it was from visual data that was around me, and also from an excuse to draw something I really wanted to draw and something that made me laugh. Like I thought it was funny. And so I kind of combined all three. But that one I also called people and was like, I don't know, like, what do you think? I looked it up, saw if it had been done. Like that's really important, I think, when you're concepting. If it's been done, do it better. I'm sure like Cory Price says that to his students too, but it's like, if you look for a concept, like if you're going to choose to illustrate Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you better compete with the brilliant artists who've already done it. You know what I mean? Or come up with an angle to it that hasn't been done before. Like maybe there's a way of showing Frankenstein that hasn't been done before. But the point being, like all of the things that I think it's important to kind of be in life, to be observing life, to be aware of yourself too, and be aware of your own humor and your own interests. I know there's like a whole side of graphic design that talks about like, you know, you're not your own client, and that's a very popular thing to say. But the longer I've been in the industry, the more I realize, like when an artist doesn't give a shit about a job they're working on, it shows. Like it shows in the art, and it doesn't matter if that's like a brochure for like a dentist or well, like what, no matter how commercial it is. If the artist's heart is completely not in it, you can just tell. It's this weird thing. So I actually think it has to be personal, and it has to be something like, if you're doing something humorous, it should make you laugh. If it's not making you laugh, I think putting that expectation on other people to laugh based on like a joke or a concept of yours is pretty far-fetched, you know? So yeah. So I do think like I do think having personal investment in it and being aware of yourself, being aware of your own weaknesses, like your own blind sides, I think that's where, like what Cory was talking about, where you have like a crew to like spitball with, can help you avoid your own blind sides. Because sometimes I'll think something's funny that's not, or I'll think something's clever that's not, or I'll think this is a really great idea, and I'll verbalize it to someone, and they're like, that just doesn't make any sense, you know? It's like that feeling when you have a really brilliant dream and you tell someone about it, and they're like, that's not coherent, you know? Like,
right. And this is why I talk about this all the time. Your brain is kind of a problem-solving machine, but it is also efficient to a fault. And so it will fill in gaps with chemicals rather than with storytelling. Yeah. And so like inside of your head, you're like, yeah, I was in my apartment in California, and then I opened the closet, and then I was walked through the closet, and I was in Paris, and blah, blah, blah. And it just it feels totally normal and makes total sense. And at no point in time are you like, well, that was weird. Right. And then the floor was Jello, and, obviously. So then you start telling that to someone, and once it leaves your head, you start to see where it's like, and they go, well, how did you, or this is the worst thing ever, right? This is happening to me multiple times. In my dreams, I write the best song that has ever been written, and I perform it and I sing it. And then the next morning I can't hum a bar or remember a lyric because the song didn't exist. The feeling of the song existed. My brain was like, there's a song that you wrote and it's incredible. And in my dream, I never questioned, oh yeah, let's hear it, or whatever. And then the next morning I'm like, oh yeah, well, that's frustrating. Okay. I want to talk technique. This is one. So one of the more recent ones I did, I might have to turn the lights down. So I wanted to say something about kind of the protests and what people were saying and everything at the time. Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of what I did. So I started with people. And then I was like, okay, so there's people. And then I was like, there's black people, there's white people. And then I started writing lists, right? So power, money, dark, slave ship, downtrodden. And then I started talking about like, what is it that's actually makes a person? That's something that's more than an animal. So I was like love, heart, mind, blood, hug, embrace, punch, kiss, rainbow, Care Bear stare. Like not everything on this list makes sense, right? And that's a key point to like making these lists. Is that you can't let your inner critic get in the way. You're there to just open the faucet and write whatever happens. So then I said cops, military, pepper spray, batons, guns, rubber bullets, looking the other way, bad apples, worshipped, tanks, armored cars, expectation of peaceable protest in the midst of violence. And then I started kind of like, this is where some of the ideas start flowing. Some of the stuff I still might do. I thought of just like animating a Jim or a crow named Jim that was just like spouting off all of this rhetoric and stuff. A cop as a Catholic saint that's on fire, done up in like a style. A cop with like a beat cop with like a traffic sign with like a pile of bodies behind him. Then let's see, what else did I have? Just a bunch of cops beating somebody, yelling, stop resisting, and they're obviously not resisting. A police sergeant hand lighting the First Amendment on fire. And so I have like a little sketch of that. A police badge, but in the badge, you see symbolism of like cities burning instead of like the crest of like the city. You see like a police officer like walking by a bunch of different scenes of cops beating people. And then the police officer gets to the end of that. And somebody says, oh, that's one of our good cops, cause he wasn't beating anyone, but he wasn't stopping anybody either. And then eventually from all of that, I took the First Amendment one, which is this one. I have that. And then I thought, there's probably something with the First Amendment. And so then I started thinking like, what are visual ways? So you go from the concept, the words themselves and the ideas, and then you go to like, how do you visually address this? And so I started thinking of like how to visually address the First Amendment. And it's really hard because it is a piece of paper with writing on it. And it's an older piece of paper. So you could get a little bit of that like kind of, like weathered, yellowed, with the quill writing, but I was still struggling with it. And then I started thinking, who else has done this? And that got me to Schoolhouse Rock, where it was like, I'm just a bill and whatever. So I actually looked up that, and then the whole idea became a parody of Schoolhouse Rock in the modern era. Here that I haven't done yet. And so clustering or batching process, because you get into this mindset, and when you're into the mindset, it's not like your brain stops at one idea.
Yeah. And the thing that's neat too is like, I think even you're walking through that process too, is like, not all of those later ideas were bad. And the great thing is not all of them were great. And what's beautiful is like, I mean, Greg mentioned this in the chats too, that Seth Godin says people who think they don't have enough good ideas don't have enough bad ideas. I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
But I like, for me, like when I used to concept t-shirts, I would do exactly what you're describing. I still do that too. If I'm ever iterating a new concept. Luckily I've been married to the same concept for, a good chunk of years on the majority of what I've been working on. But even with that, like with that book, it's like when I'm thumbnailing, when I'm roughing things out, I try to be open to approaching things from a different angle. And I think one of the keys when you're an illustrator is like, I mean, you want to come up with that unconventional angle, that staging. Like you're kind of like a director of a play, and so you need to come up with the lighting, the costuming, the staging to make your play unique, like your little visual play unique. And one of the things that helps with that is like what you were talking about, where it's like iterating an idea first. So if you're coming up with the idea wholesale, and it helps to have a concept, like a rough concept. It helps to spitball it. It helps to make word lists. I also like the idea of just jotting down a concept in like a short sentence for a single illustration. If you can't say it in like 3 words, 4 words, like it might be overly complicated for a single image. But like once you've done that, spitball it with other people. Like there was a comic I did for Devastator. I still remember this vividly because I relied on a bunch of friends of mine, where the theme was like spy jokes, and so like I pitched this concept of like I just thought it would be really funny if Q from James Bond was pitching science projects, like 7th grade science projects. And so he was like, and I really wanted to somehow work in like Q putting baking soda in a volcano and like showing Bond like as if that's the coolest new gizmo he had created. And so what I did with that concept, like I had a bunch of different concepts. That was my favorite. I went to a bar. I met up with Chris Caligula and then a couple other illustrator friends of mine, and over drinks, like we spitballed and worked that idea. And like a lot of that was just them asking questions like, well, so how does he end up with the science project? Like, right. Like, how does this happen? Like, so it got more developed through a conversation with friends where I came up with a backstory for it. So it's like Q's heading to work. He gets his kids' science project mixed with his project. So his kid goes to the science fair and ends up taking like a car that's rigged with like machine guns and stuff to the science fair. And then he's pitching this to Bond. So that's the second level to it, right? And it got so much more developed, like from just the one pitch where he's going through every bad like kit science fair project, known to man, like, you can power your batteries with this orange and this lemon, and so it developed from that, but it got stronger through conversation with friends and through kind of like a workshopping process. And I think that's really important too for like iterating a concept. But I also think it's good to talk about visuals too, where it's like the visual staging of it. This is something I often do where it's like when I'm thumbnailing, and I want to hear Scott on this too, but it's like when I'm thumbnailing, I always tend to draw the ground flat. That's my first instinct, is the ground is always like, it's perfect. I never draw things at an angle. It's
horizontal. It's a third of the way up.
Exactly.
Line.
Yeah. And when I draw characters, like just my gut instinct is usually to draw them stiff. So I know that about myself as an artist, and I've studied illustration long enough to know that about myself. So what I do is I keep that in check. Like usually if I draw something on a flat plane that's perfect, where you put it like a 90-degree angle there, I usually ask myself a lot of questions. And like when I'm paneling, I want to think, am I doing this in an obvious way, or would it make sense to tilt that angle? Like tilting the angle is like a trick that I rarely see, especially cartoonists don't use as often as they should. And Kirby understood this. That's why Kirby is like pages, like Jack Kirby, when you look at his comic pages, they're like dynamic and moving. And a lot of it's because like Kirby rarely had somebody just standing on a on a straight symbolic ground, right? Like he, you know, if somebody was running, he'd tilt the floor, you know, because you can do that. Like, so that's something I always try to consider too, as well as like staging. Like, is the lighting reinforcing the emotion I'm trying to get across in what I'm doing? Is the size of the character reinforcing something? Like, you know, children's books are excellent at this too, where it's like, you know, if you were reading a kid's book and it was talking about a kid being lonely and he's in his room and he's filling up the panel, like filling up the page, right? He's this giant kid just filling the entire page because you really zoomed in on that kid. It's not going to feel lonely, right? But if you pulled out in your viewpoint and you have the kid in this giant room that fills most of the space of the page, and then maybe the page is filled with you know, like stuffed animals and toys and stuff like that are in the kid's room, and they're actually the dominant thing in the frame, and then you have this tiny little kid right in the corner isolated, and maybe it's tilted at an angle where all the lines lead to kind of isolate that kid, like you're separating that kid visually. Then you're making the viewer like actually feel like, if the kid's talking about being lonely, you're having them feel the loneliness, as opposed to just kind of say lonely, show a kid alone. It's like you also want to think about the feeling. So that's something I always consider as an illustrator too. And I will say it's a huge advantage. Like, you know, when I've illustrated for clients who like I had no means illustrating for on a skill level. But a lot of why I'd get work was because I would do an editorial illustration where somebody was running and you'd feel them running. And the only reason is a lot of those tricks where it's like I'd tilt the frame, I'd make the character like kind of not necessarily like right in the center of the illustration, right? Like I'd put them in an area where it looked like they were running. You know, I'd consider different uses of perspective. I mean, like, you don't always have to use literal perspective. You can always get into like isometric and do cutaways and cool, crazy things. But I do think all of that starts with like, you do your first sketch and then you take that sketch and you trash it, like you burn it. Like, it's your first instinct as an artist, like with sketching, is usually wrong unless you're drawing from life. Your first instinct's usually wrong. And so like, I don't know. I find that really helpful. I don't know, Scott, like, how do you overcome like the obvious, you know, like the first choice kind of thing when you're designing a poster or a book?
Well, I mean, I kind of approached it similar to, and I didn't get a good look at Cory's notes, but like when he was writing his things out, I tend to use mind maps because they're nonlinear. Yeah. And you know, I'm sure Cory has all like, he had little illustrations and things, but it's a way that you can, you know, visually take notes. And if you're not familiar with mind maps, you know, you can look it up. It's, you know, but for me, that's usually how I approach something. So yeah. And then, you know, you basically start with something in this, like the center, instead of starting a list with the headline and then just jot down, because it's kind of hard to move things in. And so, yeah, you've got your main thing and everything branches out like a tree, and it just keeps branching out. And you can kind of look at it all at once, and you can do it with, you know, sometimes it helps to do with different colors and things like that, and just a lot of illustrations, and just take these visual notes. So that's usually how I approach brainstorming. I don't, is it called brainstorming if it's just you?
So brainstorming is actually a very specific set of rules that a group will do together, and it's usually moderated. Yeah, I mean, the word is mutated, but I mean the actual brainstorming practice is not what most people think it is.
Yeah. So, but I've done that in a setting like when I used to work in game design, coming up with concepts. And I wish I had. I've been looking for my notebook for that, because I had this one game we came up with. I had a 2 or 3 really good concepts that they didn't necessarily go with, but I thought they were a little more original than what we did go with, because this ended up being sort of a Pokemon style game, and it was very similar to that, but yeah, I had some ideas, with that, and I did all those using mind maps and everything. But then, and then I do take linear notes, like I use Trello, and I use Evernote, basically just because I always have that, I've got those on my phone. So anytime I come up with an idea, and and a lot of times I don't actually, it depends what the project. If there's a project, like I have a project where I have to come up with ideas, like some of these coloring books are that way, where I know I need to do 24 different illustrations or something for a coloring book, and then so I'll jot ideas down that way for those. But sometimes a lot of ideas are just when they come to me, like I'm not even looking for them. Like, oh, that's an idea I can. And I've got kind of like, I'm sure Josh had when he was doing t-shirts, and maybe still does. I've just got a laundry list of ideas of shirts that I could do. Some of them are, some of the older ones are more parody based, and I can't really do those now through Amazon because they don't really, they don't mess with parody at all. So, but there's some good ideas there that I can mine. But I've got, it's like, when you hear people that are like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I need an idea for this or that. And for me, it's just like, you just got to kind of be open to it. So when they come to you, and like Josh, the other thing that Josh said that kind of hit a chord with me is that you're hit on something if you come up with this idea and you search to see if anyone else has done it. Because most of the time I do that and like, oh man, somebody already came up with that. Yeah. And every once in a while you get one that doesn't. Like I just came up with a particular pun that I'm like, oh, somebody's got to do this, and and I couldn't find anyone that had, and so that's going to go on a t-shirt. But yeah, so I don't know. I mean, some of it's sitting down doing mind maps. Some of it's just when things come to you, make sure you write that down. A lot of times, and there are some times where I will dream of something and it's actually a decent idea. Those are few or far between. Most of the time, it's like Cory said, where it's just like, oh, man, this made so much sense in my dream. It was like a brilliant idea, and this like, what? I don't know, but
yeah,
so I don't know.
So Josh and Scott, I have a question about mind maps. When I do mind maps, I found I did this as an example. Like if you have like this word, and then several other words, you can do multiple mind maps. The thing that really works for me is when I take several levels away from each of these words, like I've done in red, and start connecting those. So I might take something from this and something from this, and the connection of those two things becomes a thing.
Yeah.
And the thing that's really interesting about that is this works in advertising really easily. And so each one of these words becomes a competitive advantage of your client. And then you start to, I just did this 2 weeks ago. You start to expand that out on those competitive advantages of your client. And then you do another mind map that is about their target audience. And then you do another mind map about their core objectives with that campaign. And what will happen is that you will find that there are connections that you can make about certain things that have started from but grown away from their audience, and started from but grown away from their product, that then becomes something interesting because of that. And it'll be related because of where it started from, but it won't be obvious because it's several levels away from that initial concept.
Yeah. And the thing I always want to clarify to people too is like, obvious isn't bad. It's just, it should be obvious to the person who looks at it, but not to the person who creates it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like,
I was going to say there is something to be said for cliche. Sometimes you want cliche because it's iconic and it's the easiest to digest and it's the easy to get like right away. So a lot of times, even when I'm coming up with, like I was doing a coloring book, and I had all these different, it dealt with all these different occupations and everything. So I just searched clip art for that particular occupation, because then it shows you the most common things, like these are the tools they use. And then I would elaborate and I'd change it and I'd stylize it. But, you know, and a lot of things that I remember when I worked for a film studio, and they were at the point where they were moving from film to digital. And I had done these icons of like the film reels and things like that. And they were like, oh, I don't know if we want to use that because we're digital and that's analog, but you can't show digital. And it's like, it doesn't, I mean, people, even if it doesn't exist anymore, like when you go to save something, a lot of times there's an icon of a floppy disk. Most younger people don't even know what a floppy disk are, but they know what that icon is. They know it means save.
Yeah.
So I mean, don't be too afraid of cliche, because those are the things, because a lot of times you have to boil something down to its most recognizable form, and that's going to be what your cliches are.
So and I like that, but I think I want to push back a little bit. And I know that you are doing this, Scott. But just for those that are learning, obvious isn't bad, but only obvious is bad.
Exactly.
Right. And so if I need to convey doctor, I want to convey the idea of a doctor in the most obvious way that doctor can be, and then twist something. It's this concept called bent straight. And bent straight is there's something in it that is straight, that's obvious, that's what you would expect. It's cliche. It's the symbol of that thing. And then there's something else that is twisted. And I say that, I don't know, I'm pretty sure I came up with this, but I don't know where, if I didn't, I don't know where I got it. But I always say creativity can come from any combination of four things. What can you add? What can you subtract? What can you exaggerate? And what can you simplify?
Yeah, that's really well said.
And if you can do one or more of those four things to something that's very obvious, it starts with something that's cliche, or what graphic designers and visual creators will call codification. It's been codified. Like society has decided that symbol means that thing.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing about a red octagon with a white border around it on a pole to the right of the road that actually means that you should put a certain amount of pressure with your right foot on the middle pedal. But we've all decided together to codify that thing as a stop sign and a series of actions that we don't even really think about while we're driving to do those things. But if you can take that and you can add, eliminate, simplify, or exaggerate, then you can take that known element and change something about it so that it says something. And so, sometimes the lack of something, it says huge amounts of things, right? Or the addition of something says huge amounts of things. And it can just be that little tiny little bit that alters the entire meaning.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought those up. Like, to me, I just look at it as juxtaposing something. And it doesn't have to be much. But what's surprising is how many illustrators don't. So here's the thing. Like, you can make it a scale juxtaposition, right? And that's going to make a more interesting composition if you do big and small, right? If you do hard and soft, like you do, I mean, there are so many just visual juxtapositions you can do that have nothing to do with the concept. However, if you're a smart illustrator, it will have something to do with the concept. Like, you'll choose hard versus soft when you're trying to represent softness or toughness. And so you're showing how tough it is by juxtaposing it next to softness, like whatever it is. But the point being, like, that can be nature with mechanical, like, and the neat thing about that is, like, it can be two juxtaposed ideas. It can be, you know, at its lowest form, it's a pun, right? A pun is a juxtaposition, right? Of like two things that are different, but they sound the same. So there's a commonality and there's a difference, and you're kind of playing up the difference for humor. But like, so to me, I always look for juxtaposition in whatever it is. And I'm glad Cory broke that down, because those four categories are pretty much where you can do juxtaposition. But if you're not showing like contrast in that sense, it's, you know, I agree with Cory a lot in like what he kind of led off with this with. I always told my students, you know, because like there were some teachers who were very like technique based teachers, and all they cared about their students coming out with was technical skills. And I was teaching in an illustration program where I felt like that's great to have those technical skills, but like I saw the work coming out of those classes and it all looked exactly the same. Like where it's like, you know, you're going to render a duck today, and then they'd all render the same duck, and it looked like, you know, they all learned the same rendering techniques. And so what you ended up with was all these wonderful photographs of ducks, and I could care less who did it. Like it all looked excellent, but I don't know who the artists were. And to me, it's like, if you want to draw ducks and render ducks, like just go buy a 4K, you know, camera and like, you know, get really good at photography. Like, you know, but if you want to say something, then like get into illustration. If you want to say something, get into visual communication.
Yeah.
And I think like that always is going to give you a heads up, because the problem with the rendered duck thing, where there's no thought, it's just centered, it's a beautiful rendering of the same thing. And I'm not saying, I've seen artists do renderings of ducks where you know the artist from it, right? So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just like, you know, it looks so real I could touch it kind of art. It's like I just to me at that point, it's also going to be hard for you to compete as that artist who's just rendering ducks, because there's a bunch of artists who can render a duck and center it and like make a fairly boring composition with a very well rendered duck. I think all three of us could sit down and probably render something very photorealistically if we had enough time, the right tools. So I think pushing beyond that and like doing, like implementing some of these ideas is good. I also agree with Scott on something he said before too about, and I think Cory's there too. The neat thing about when you start doing these mind maps, like for me, it's not as organized because I'm an organization in chaos kind of person. So I just have like crazy checklists, you know, like on a torn up envelope. And I write ideas down all the time. Fill sketchbooks with them, whatever. It's random. But the nice thing is, whatever your method is to kind of get down the auditory or the written idea and the visual idea and sketch it out, the more you practice that, you end up being in this position that I think all three of us are in, where it's like, I don't run out of ideas. I don't get blocked. I have too many. And so it's an idea, like at this point in my life, it's more about filtering out the bad ones, but it's not hard to concept. It's
so
not.
I think there's a key to that Scott brought up.
Yeah.
Constantly capturing them, because your brain is like a muscle, right? And so the way that your muscles work is that they are going to be just toned enough to do what they're expected to do. Mm-hmm. That's all working out is like, you're like, see this heavy thing I'm lifting? I'm going to do this in 2 days. And I'm going to do it 2 days after that. And your muscles are finally like, fine, I'll get bigger because it feels like I'm required to lift this heavy thing, right? Your brain is the same way. It will become efficient at what it is required to do on a regular basis. And so if you require creativity of yourself regularly, and then you capture that creativity, you're actually training your brain to continue to output creativity. But if you get good ideas and you don't capture them, you're training your brain to say, this is not an important activity. It will not do it anymore after that. You gotta redo it. What's that?
There's a Mitch Hedberg joke where he talks about how he keeps I'm going to butcher this, but something about how he keeps a pen by his bed, so if he wakes up, he can write down a joke. Or he says he keeps a pen around or something, so he can write down a joke if he comes up with an idea. And if he's too lazy or the pen's too far away, he has to convince himself that what he thought of wasn't funny.
Right.
I like that.
Okay, lightning round. I've got a list, and we're just going to real quick thoughts about this list. So we've already talked about mind maps. Real quick rules on mind mapping. While you're doing it, your inner critic is completely useless. So ignore any thought that tells you that it's wrong, that it's misspelled, that it doesn't work, that it doesn't make sense. Just ignore all of that. It's a flow state.
Mm-hmm.
Have you guys ever done blackout poetry?
I haven't, but I'm familiar. That's like with what's it, Austin Kleon or whatever.
Austin Kleon does a lot of blackout poetry. So take some printed material. It could be a bill that you get in the mail, a newspaper, a magazine, or whatever. And you take a Sharpie, and instead of adding stuff, you're eliminating stuff. It's interesting because most of the time we think about creativity as an additive process where we are adding the creativity, but blackout poetry forces you to work with existing things and just remove what doesn't make sense. And there are several rules of like top to bottom, left to right. You can't like draw arrows, but you can cut a word in half. You can delete full parts of sentences. And I like to say you can't have more than 2 words together. You've got to black out. You can't have like a phrase that you use.
Oh, I do want to tack on too. I think it's important if you're leading people, like as an art director and Cory as a creative director, I think you can attest to this too. Scott too, you've worked with small teams of artists and teams of artists. So it's like when you're leading teams of artists, keep in mind what we're telling the artists, right, about creative, because the quickest way to destroy a creative team or out of the box thinking is to do the opposite. When you're having like a spaghetti at the wall meeting, be like, oh, that won't work. That's terrible. Like initially, if you do that at the inception of a creative discussion, you've just quelled and killed that potential fire that's going to be lit that gets you to a great idea. And so
verbally reward the most outlandish concepts that will never work.
Yeah.
And laugh and enjoy it.
Yeah, entertain those ideas too, because sometimes those crazy outlandish ideas end up being the best ones. You know?
Yeah,
or definitely lead to better ideas.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Okay, another one that I've done that I like, the Scribble Game. I think there's an actual name for it, but where somebody scribbles on a piece of paper, just a quick thing, and then you all pass papers to the left or to the right, and you have to turn it into something that isn't a snake and isn't a face.
I love it. One of my favorites is a face game. It's weird, but it's like you basically draw a shape. You draw the weirdest shape you can think of, and it has to be a closed shape. And then you pass to the next person. They can't alter the shape, but they have to make it into a face. And it's
like inside of the shape as if the shape is the head.
Yes. And actually that's what a lot of the guys at UPA did. And so I love that, because for character designs and coming up with things that are outside of the box, like you can definitely see it looking at UPA too, where it's like, how did they think to have like the nose above the eyes? And like, it's just such a weird, awesome shape. So that was something they used to exercise that they wanted to do. Some of those guys wanted to do with Disney. And so when they left Disney, they were like, we're doing this.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyway.
Okay, the next one, free association. So this is done in psychology a lot, but you sit down with a partner, and like if Scott and I were doing this, I would say a word, Scott would say whatever comes to mind. It doesn't matter, any word. And then I forget about my word, and whatever he just said, I react to that, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it's like mind mapping, except you're doing it verbally and linearly. So you're both going down a path. And you don't worry about deviations because there's no forks in the road. There's just the road. And what you'll find is you'll get about 20 steps away from something, and it is something weird and different and very odd. If you're like me, I am an upbeat, happy person, but every time I do this, it gets dark really fast. I don't know why it is, but like it always ends up with like murder or suicide or something weird. I don't know what that is, but there's probably some psychologists that can tell me. But that's a really good one. And what I like about it is it's the same concept as mind map, where you start with something related, and so you can logically get there.
I have one tip to throw on there. I don't know if this is on the list, but I'd say also like have a deadline for yourself, especially for your own concepting, because you can end up in a mind map or on a road to nowhere. With a lot of these ideas, you can end up with like mind maps that feel like your house. Like you just
Right.
draw all over your walls. And I've met writers who do that too, where like they've mapped out a story so far that they're never gonna do the story. Like they're just their eternal job is mapping it. So I do think it's important to be like when I come up with this concept, when I get something ready to go, especially when it's your own concepts, I think it's important to at some point pull the trigger. And what helps with that is by doing some of this process, because it makes you less fragile with what you have. Like you're not sold on the one thing. One of the most frustrating things as an instructor is having the student who's like coming to art school to get better as an artist. And the first critique, they're like, but that's my style. Like you don't critique my style. And you're like, well, why did you go to school? Like if you already have your style set and you're making like the art you want to make, like don't have a teacher. Say similar thing. Like it makes the problem with that is you're so connected and hooked on one idea that you're not open to other possibilities. And I think that part of this process makes you less fragile about that. Like if you're on that road Cory was just describing, and you say something you're really married to, but you're still in the exercise, it's like, you never know. You might end up 10 steps down the road where you're like, oh, what was that stupid thing I was married to before? Like, this is way better. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's, but it is important to like pull the trigger on the idea.
Yeah. And I have one that's like that, that I'll get to, but it's basically timed sketches. So get an interval timer. Like you can download an interval timer on your computer or a phone. And one of the things that I've seen is when people are iterating ideas in thumbnail stages, where you're just drawing, everybody has a different size, but it's 1/2 inch to about 4 inches. Anything bigger than about 4 inches has to be much, much bigger. And so like I will draw on like 20 by 30 sheets of paper, because then I'm using my shoulder and there's like a different mechanic, but 1/2 inch to 4 inches. And if you spend longer than 10 seconds on it, you're drawing, you're not sketching. And you sketch for ideas. And so what you do, the rule is this, is you draw as fast as you possibly can. And when the bell rings, you ask yourself a what if question and you draw the answer. What if this was bigger? What if that was smaller? What if I rotated it? What if I changed the angle? What if this happened? What if this happened? What if it was blue? What if I just did that again? What if it was broken? What if it was fixed? What if it, whatever? What if it was made by an alien? What if it, you ask yourself one what if question and you iterate based on that. And what'll happen is that you will start to see, it's like going to be one of those lines where you see the evolution of man. It's going to be like that. And you start to get away from things and you can start to track and see how that happens. And when you get something good, keep going. Do like another 20 of them. But the thing about this is it's exhausting. It's really hard to do, but it'll get you out of your toxic perfectionism, because toxic perfectionism will start to, there are some rules with all of these. If you're judging that looks bad, then you're like too far down the road, because there are no, it looks bad thoughts in the iteration process. It looks bad is when you're in self-critique, when you're doing like your compositional sketches, when you're trying to do the layout, like what Holly was talking about earlier, when you're trying to figure out like how this should look. Right now, you're just trying to get what the idea is. So doing time sketches, you will only be able to last about 3 minutes. And if you get really good and you do this often, about 5 or 6 minutes before you're actually exhausted. But you will have hundreds of really, really good ideas. If you can do that for 5 minutes, you're doing what? 6 ideas. So you have 35 different iterations of that things in 5 minutes. So that's one. Another one, I got this from Tim Schafer, the guy who owns and founded Double Fine Adventures. If you guys haven't watched 2-Player Productions documentary series on Double Fine Adventures making a video game, it is one of the best things on the internet. But anyway, every morning he sits down and does free writing, and his free writing is this: he continues to write words without thinking about the words, and he fills 2 full single-spaced notebook pages every morning at the start of his day. And then what happens is whenever he gets stuck for ideas, for dialogue, for whatever else, he goes back to his notebooks and he discovers what he wrote, because he goes into kind of like a flow state and is just writing. I also think there's a huge thing for visual artists to do the same thing but do free drawing. Don't draw things, but just move the pen around the paper, geometric shapes. Or I used to do this where you'd like down the line notebook paper, the college ruled paper. I'd go in front of the red line and behind the red line, in front of the red line and behind the red line. And I just do these like little vines, or whatever. But just moving shapes and scribbling, just do, get movement going. And what you'll find is that you can start to feel when you switch states of mind. So you've got different modalities in your brain, and they feel different. And so a creative modality feels different than an analytical modality. Literally, when you're in the analytical modality, you don't have the ability to comprehend verbal communication or the passage of time. That's why we say time flies when you're having fun, because creativity is fun. Mm-hmm. And when you're in the creative modality, you don't have a concept of time, because if you think about time, it's exact, precise, linear, logical, mathematical movements of something in a logical way. Mm-hmm. And if you're trying to be nonlinear and irrational, you've got to throw that out the window. And so time flies when you're having fun, because you've moved into a creative mindset. And so if you start to feel that, and you start to, I want you to be very conscious of that switch. What you can do is you can start to do activities where you choose to go into that state of mind. And the worst thing I think for creatives is to wait for the mood to strike. I'm waiting for inspiration to strike. I'm waiting for my muse. I'm waiting for a good. Don't wait. You can actually control when you are creative and train yourself to be creative in that way.
So
go ahead. Sorry.
Actually, just to tack onto that, like the flow state thing you're describing, like for me, that happens in my comics and even on my scripts, and usually when I'm writing, it doesn't happen initially. But when I force myself to do it, it'll be like a couple days in, like if I'm doing it daily, it'll be like a couple days into like a weekend where it just starts transcending. And so it goes to like this state of like, almost like clocking in for a job at first, the way it feels, to suddenly having just stuff happen that was not intended, was not planned, and just kind of flows in to that workflow. And so I'm a big believer in that, like in the idea of like, in a weird way, sometimes setting up structures and repetition can help create like a lot of creative freedom, similar to what you were talking about of the reductive kind of way of writing, right?
Yeah.
Where it's very similar to that, where when you have certain barriers and you know what those are, you suddenly have like a playroom, like, and you know what you can play with. And then it's pretty amazing what you can do with limited material when you actually the freedom that allows. Right.
So I have two more. One is more compositional, but if you find yourself, if you're a noodler, if you like to noodle the details before you like get the general thing, switch tools to something that's really imprecise. Mm-hmm. A broken, dried out Sharpie or finger painting, or like I've literally gone out with a stick and done it and drawn in the dirt or whatever, or giant, like newspapers, or ripping it out of whatever. Because that changing it up, it actually eliminates the thing that's getting in your way, which is it eliminates the noodling details before you get the foundational elements of things down. The last thing that I've got on my list, and then if you guys have any more, I'm interested, but I'm curious if you guys have ever done this, because this one is weird, right? It's an exercise in empathy. Build a character. What do they love? What do they hate? What do they want? What do they wish for? What are they scared of? Build a character, right? Do that character as different from you as you possibly can. What's interesting is when I lead groups of creatives, because I'll go on retreats and people will hire me to like lead this type of thing. It's interesting to see that your initial response to this person that you're building is to mock them. Your initial response is to make fun of them. And I let that happen, right? And then I point that out and I say, now I want you to do any one of these activities that we've already done as that person, and don't do it ironically and don't do it sarcastically. Get inside their head and think like they think, and be like them, and have those thoughts like they would have. Process the world through their eyes and do blackout poetry. process the world through their eyes and do free writing, process the world through their eyes and do time sketches, or how would this person solve this problem? And what's really fascinating is that you start to get the ability to kind of switch hit personalities, which sounds a little dangerous psychologically, but if you're writing or creating multiple characters, the ability to empathize with people that don't think like you is absolutely essential, because something that is full of you is really boring, right? Because if two people are the same, one of them is not necessary, especially in storytelling. You should just combine all those characters into one character, right? But it's fascinating. Have you guys ever done anything like that? That I just call it play a role. Yeah.
Well, it's also a lot of us were nerds, and so I'm guessing a lot of us might have actually literally role played when we were younger. But it's like I think that ability it also makes for a lot of fun, and I think one of my favorite things. Like one of my favorite books is this book, Jimmy Corrigan, Smartest Kid on Earth by Chris Ware. And it actually kind of starts off, it's interesting. You can see the evolution of it as the story progresses, because it starts off almost like gag strips that are kind of making fun of this like pathetic character, right? And then it starts to just become more and more empathetic to this character from these gag strips and becomes this like poetic, just crazy deep story. And it seems like a story that was kind of riffed on, like you were saying, Cory, where it starts out like a little bit humorous and unempathetic, and then you can kind of see the artist and the writer kind of get involved in the character's well-being, and you feel it as a reader too, and it makes it a really compelling story that's a lot more interesting than just like some slapstick guy falling on his face,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, so if you are looking to do this, I think there are 3 easy things that you can do to get yourself into this state of mind. So if you're looking to come up with ideas, one is you need to, and Greg was kind of saying this earlier, with having a gap for people to figure things out in storytelling. Your brain also needs that gap to be able to come up with those ideas. And so thing number 1 is delete something from your day. Thing number 2 is add something to your day. And thing number 3 is require creativity of yourself. And so thing number 1 is this: find something where you're normally entertained and eliminate all entertainment. Find what I call programmed time and eliminate the programming. So if you poop with your iPhone in your hand, leave your phone out of the bathroom and just sit there and stare at the wall while you do it, right? If you eat breakfast while you're reading a book or listening to a podcast, or if you commute, whatever, eliminate some programming from your day. 30 minutes is a good thing. If you do that, it'll really switch this on. You'll switch over to what neurologists call the default mode network, which is a state of daydreaming. The other thing is to add something to your day. So you want to add some sort of creative practice. Usually that's after the boredom. So something where there is zero reason to worry whether or not you succeed, right? Crocheting, finger painting, whittling a stick sharp. It doesn't matter. Literally, you could throw the results of that thing away every day and it wouldn't matter. But doing that. And then the other thing is kind of what we do here, some sort of public accountability of some sort of progress, right? Mm-hmm. So I like the sticker stint. I came up with the idea of the sticker stint because I was trying to infuse this practice. But what it requires is that I've got to start and finish a design every day for 30 days straight. Mm-hmm. If you do that, what you will find is that all of these other practices become useful tools to that end goal, but you will shift the way that you're thinking and train your brain to become creative. It is not true that some people are born creative and other people are not. Everybody is born creative, and the systems that surround us eliminate that creativity. And those of us that have remained creative or regained our creativity did that in spite of the systems that surround us. Mm-hmm. You can learn creativity, and you can improve your creativity, and you can use your creativity as a tool to your own ends. Mm-hmm. It's not something that's outside of your control.
Agreed. No, I love it. I think I just want to say, like, I really appreciate the 48-hour art check and being able to check in with you guys like at minimum once a week, because it's just a nice way to kind of make sure that we're all being creative. And I do think that accountability really helps, and it has helped. And it's part of why I finished the book. So I do want to say, like, put the stuff into practice, you guys. You can end up with the thing you wanted actually out there in the world, which is kind of